Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.
One of my beliefs is that the reason the human species has had this incredibly steady state of improvement over the years and better, longer lifespans and healthier lifespans and vaccines and cures and all these things is because we've been led by optimists who have driven for those things and gotten off their duffs to do something about it. The biggest risk we have of that stopping is if we cave to pessimism and cynicism.
That's today's guest on Sidebar, Bill Burke, founder of the Optimism Institute.
Sidebar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, and Empire College of Law, located in Santa Rosa.
Welcome to Sidebar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your co-hosts, Jackie Gardina and Mitch Winnick.
Jackie, I'm thrilled to have Bill Burke join us today on Sidebar Optimism in Action. In fact, it was an easy decision to ask Bill because he shares one thing very much in common with our program, since we are Optimism in Action, and he founded the Optimism Institute. Now, you look at Bill's background, and you wouldn't necessarily think this is where he was going to go with it. He's got an impressive background in media and sports, but then it comes to the end of his bio, and he says he launched the Optimism Institute to combat the negative effects of news and social media on mental health. And I got to tell you, that's a topic that I think all of our listeners will be interested in. Bill, welcome today to Sidebar.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I appreciate being invited.
And welcome, Bill. I'm excited to have you here as well. And I think before we dive into what brought you to this place, I just want to make sure we're all working off of the same definition. When you use the word optimism, how do you define that? What do you mean?
That's a great question because, as you probably know, there's all kinds of different definitions. Some I like, some I don't. So I made up my own. I think there's an active part of optimism that's very important. So I say that an optimist believes that tomorrow will be better than today and that they have a role to play in making it so. And so with that, it's not someone who just sits around and, assumes things are going to get better, and they will. Instead, they think things can get better, but they get out and do something to try to make it so.
Bill, I particularly like some of the topics you go out and speak about. They focus around this issue of optimism, but they take some nuances that really resonate with me. I love your one, the return on integrity as an aspect of optimism. Talk a little about that.
I actually worked on a book by that title, Return on Integrity. Publishers didn't think it was as good as I did. I was raised, fortunately, by very successful business people who also happen to be incredibly ethical people and led with integrity. So I grew up just thinking that was normal. And then when you start seeing movies and reading headlines, you realize there are some people out there who are less that way. And unfortunately, I think in my background, it's mostly business. If your view of business is formed by what you see in the movies and what you read in the headlines, you think that everybody's Gordon Gekko and Bernie Madoff and on the take. And my personal experience is that by far, the vast majority of people out in business are trying to do the right thing and are leading with integrity. And so the idea of return on integrity was that not only you can succeed in spite of your ethical behavior, I think you succeed because of it. And your customers trust you, your employees trust you. And I think it's a key to being successful in anything you do. But that book was primarily focused on business.
And for those who don't necessarily draw the line, talk about the connection between optimism and integrity.
Yeah, I think that there's a connection in that you can believe that life will continue to get better if you believe that people are good and positive and trying to do the right thing. If you believe, however, that everyone's a crook and a criminal, and why wouldn't you be pessimistic? And I think, frankly, what is it? A clean conscience makes a light pillow or something like that. It's just better for your own well-being and your general outlook all the way around. So I think, it's not a very direct, tight connection, but there's definitely one follows the other, I believe.
Just based on the definition that you gave earlier about believing that things can get better, but you need to act.
Yes.
In order to be a part of that change, it seems like acting with integrity is about ensuring that integrity becomes part of the culture and environment in which you're living or working or whatever the case may be.
Completely. And I also think it's hard to be a high integrity person and not be active. If you look around you and realize all the challenges are going unmet, to me, it takes a lack of integrity, and one way of defining it, to not take action and to be passive.
Do people push back on that when you're out talking about this action aspect of integrity? Because I think there's a general fear that when you step up and speak out, even if it's on issues such as integrity and standing up for basic standards that you believe many others in your community agree with.
And that can be a little tricky. I don't often get really hardcore skeptics. I will say, though, that I have had some people who come in very skeptical, and I think I have been able to move people a little bit. And again, I think that the vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing. They're good people. Unfortunately, the headlines are grabbed by others. What I'm hearing from people more often than not is they're just exhausted and they're tired of it. And it's like, when is this going to stop? When can we turn the corner and be positive again and work together?
Could I bridge a little to your former career in media, successful career in media? Some of the worry right now is that media may have lost that element of integrity and leadership. The very things you talk about to us in general are the very topics that we're seeing are being addressed by top media executives, including, not to pick on them, but the two senior BBC executives leave over editorial integrity. If you were in charge of advising a major media company now, how would you bridge that gap? How would you lead them down this path?
It's a great question, and I'm very concerned about the way the news media is headed. And I gave a talk last week, and I was only half joking. I have a slide where I encourage people to not watch cable news. And I'm always afraid I'm going to get struck by lightning when I say that, because I used to work for Ted Turner, and if Ted's health isn't great, and but if he was more focused on what's going on, I know he wouldn't be pleased with the direction that CNN has taken. His view was always that you report the news first and the personalities and the opinions come later. My concern is that it's not so much news anymore. It's almost 100% opinion, especially cable news. And so I would advise people, look, I understand this. This is a very tough competitive business. The audiences are getting smaller and smaller, and they're fighting for a diminishing share. So this whole it bleeds, it leads, get attention, who can scream the loudest, it tends to attract eyeballs. I may be naive, but I do think there's a lane there for more up-the-middle journalism, for telling stories. I watch the PBS NewsHour, and they let the stories breathe, and they get both sides. And, and I think, again, probably out of naivete, I would encourage at least more of that, or at least label opinion. When I was growing up, when there was an editorial at the end of a newscast, it was segregated, it was marked, it was opinion. And now you have people who've been credible journalists their whole lives who start the newscast with 5 minutes of their opinion. And the line is just gone. So that's a big concern I have. And I have great concern about the vanishing of local media and the challenges of local media business. When I lived in Maine, I was involved with a group that successfully returned some of the newspapers to a nonprofit model to try to keep them going, frankly. And they're still going, but being nonprofit doesn't necessarily make it easier. There's still a challenging business model there. So I would encourage anyone listening, read your local paper and pay for it. It would do us all a great service, I think.
Bill, it seems like the number of journalists who are joining worker-owned or not-for-profit is an indication of that optimism that you talk about. I
think so. And it's sort of an entrepreneurial spirit. One of the things I say probably more than I should on my podcast is not every optimist is an entrepreneur, but every entrepreneur had better be an optimist. And a lot of these folks are really, jumping out and trying to do the right thing. I love that movement. I think it's very healthy. I'd like to see as many as possible of those, again, trying to report either up the middle or with balanced viewpoints. A concern I have as these things develop and form is that a lot of them tend to be harder to the right or harder to the left. And we all know this, but you wake up in the morning on one side of the political spectrum, and if you listen to that same media all day, you go to bed farther to that side. And I don't think that's always healthy and good. So as these groups form, I applaud it, and there's some incredible journalism going on in these non-traditional outlets. I would just hope that either as consumers we try to balance out what we consume, or the outlets themselves try to balance what they produce.
Let's talk a little about the outlets, because as media has become more of a corporate endeavor versus local news in many cases, how are we going to combat the power of the money that appears to influence so much of this? Do we need to circle back to your original point, which is optimism in leadership, optimism and integrity in corporate leadership? Do we need to rely on that to redirect some of the investment in this type of local news or objective news or just actual news?
It's a great question. I push back a little bit on the premise. I mean, the media business has, for the most part, been for-profit kind of forever. It's been a very different business, though, with a lot of tailwinds and a lot of protective moats. There could only be so many over-the-air TV stations, so you'd have ABC, NBC, and CBS every night fighting for share, and one would get 20 and one would get 30 share. Now it's so fragmented. So I think it's always pretty much been for-profit. The difference now is they are fighting for the last scraps and getting increasingly, in some ways, desperate. And Ted Turner invented this. The 24-hour nature of news means it's an insatiable beast that has to be fed. And there's not enough news to feed it, frankly. You have to have a lot of this commentary of some sort or just repeat. I think the challenge is less the profit motive and more sort of the general business model and the clutter. Again, with that, I do think we're going to count on the integrity of some of these folks. I do think we're going to count on people who try to seek balance and not advance their own personal agenda or political beliefs. I think that's a really dangerous path that we're on. Now, one thing I push myself back onto is we tend to glamorize the past, and everything was better in the past. And we know, but from data, that in many ways, if not most, it wasn't better in the past. And I grew up on Walter Cronkite, and everybody trusted him, and that was a wonderful thing. However, there was one person, one editorial staff, who was deciding what was going to go on that night. They had incredible power. I would argue they used it well, but it's also a pretty dangerous situation when you think about it. So I think that these multiple voices, if consumed wisely, can serve a great benefit, and we shouldn't over-glamorize the past. But it's an area I have great concern about and talk a lot about on the work I do.
Support for Optimism in Action comes from the Monterey College of Law, a nonprofit law school serving the Monterey Bay region with evening classes on campus or in a hybrid online format. More details and applications available at montereylaw.edu. That's montereylaw.edu.
Bill, I want to shift us a little bit because I think the media and especially social media play into this, but your connection between optimism and mental health. And I know you certainly on your podcast, Blue Sky, have had several episodes about this, but I have a background in social work and I did outpatient clinical therapy for about 6 years before I then went to law school. So I think optimism has a place, but I worry about not acknowledging the difficulty and struggles that people have. So can you help me bridge optimism and meeting people where they are?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because in addition to people assuming, if you do the work I'm doing, that you just assume everything's always getting better, there's also this assumption sometimes that you think everything should always be great and hunky-dory and you're always in a great mood. And if my wife were behind me right now, her eyes would be rolling when I talk about being optimistic all the time. I think it's completely unrealistic. I think that's an example of sort of toxic positivity. If you just assume, oh, come on, snap out of it. Or, it's like the person who's diagnosed with cancer and someone says, well, at least you got a good doctor, and it's like, no, actually, this is really hard. And I try to emphasize that in all my talks too. And I'm particularly sensitive about it because I've been a very fortunate, privileged person. So I don't want to come off as someone who thinks that everyone should be feeling great all the time. It's never going to happen, never will. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge when people are going through challenging times. I think that trying to shift towards a more optimistic viewpoint, though, can be helpful in that. And you were a professional in this, and I don't claim to be. But I do think that figuring out ways to paint a picture of the future that in some way feels better, brighter, more positive than what you're dealing with now is a healthy thing to do. But anybody who says, you should be happy all the time, I actually bristle at a lot of the happiness literature. I think we're a little bit overloaded on it, and I always forget who it was. I need to look this up, but someone said effectively, the best way to be happy is not stopping to wonder if you are. And I think there's a lot of sort of navel gazing that goes on. And I think, frankly, it's one of the many things that social media can pick away at, too. When I watch young people and they get all excited and they go to college and they have a bad day, and then they get online and everyone who went to a different college is having a great day, and you're not happy and you should be happy. And no, you shouldn't always be happy. You should expect really bad days. Awful things are going to happen. I lost a 29-year-old niece to cancer. It was one of the worst things I've ever been through. In the middle of it, it was hard to figure out how that was in any way going to have silver linings. 6 years on, it's had many for me. I have much better empathy for people going through the same thing. I have a totally different view on raising money for cancer and why it's important, all those things. So it's a long answer to a question, but I'm glad you asked it because I think it's really important.
And Bill, you mentioned college-age individuals and college-age listeners. There's a great amount of concern about just what you talked about, where they're getting their advice, their input, or perhaps the isolation that comes from too much of a focus on social media and not actual interaction with friends and family. What can we do better, in your opinion, to try to change that trend, if indeed that is the trend we're concerned about?
I think it's a trend worth being concerned about, and I am extremely encouraged by the trend to get cell phones out of schools. I did a year-long academic fellowship a few years ago at a very prestigious university and watched these young people with their laptops open taking notes and seeing that there's very little note-taking going on, a lot of other activity. I think that if you cannot create at least an 8-hour oasis in the school day or whatever it is, 6 hours, then we've got a real problem. What I'm reading about, and a lot of the research right now is anecdotal, although some of it is factual. Kids, after a week of hardcore detox, are actually appreciating it. There was one study I saw of a school district where twice as many books have been taken out of the library than a year prior since this happened. And I've seen statistics, too, is the first year, basically since the start of social media, where overall usage is actually starting to level off and drop a little bit. I think it's coming. I think it's like a lot of us, we're pointing fingers at kids. We're terrible about it too. And I think that we're all feeling exhausted and stressed about it, and we're looking for ways out. And so I talk a lot about different, whether it's timers on your phone. I use a device called Brick, which is a physical device that you place on your phone, and it basically disables all these apps that you don't want to use. And until you go into your bag or wherever and place it back on your phone, they won't come back. So I think it's a really important issue. And I think one of my beliefs is that the reason the human species has had this incredibly steady state of improvement over the years and longer lifespans and healthier lifespans and vaccines and cures and all these things is because we've been led by optimists who have driven for those things and gotten off their duffs to do something about it. The biggest risk we have of that stopping is if we cave to pessimism and cynicism. That's my FDR copy is the only thing we have to be pessimistic about is pessimism itself. It's one of the reasons I do this work. I think it's something that could really hurt us. The next generation, which polling suggests, thinks that their lives will be worse than their parents' generations. That's a problem that we need to get after.
Assume that I'm one of the skeptics that has been dragged to your session by my optimistic friend.
Required attendance. Yes.
Exactly. It's hard out there right now. The political environment, the economic environment, the cultural environment, community split. How is it just me being optimistic as you defined it? How is that going to make the big changes? I can't stop the gridlock in Congress, so how am I going to help with any of that?
Great question. There's a good chance you won't help with a lot of that. What you can help with is your own mindset about it, the way it's making you feel, the way you are judging today in its place in history. The things you listed, with all respect, polarization, division, strife, uncertainty have been with us forever. Another reason I do this work is because I love history. I was a history major and I'm a history buff. I had a guest on my show, Kevin Kelly, who said, if you only read the news, you'll think things have never been worse. But if you read history, you'll realize things have never been better. And I believe that to my core. When people say this country has never been more divided and ignore the fact that we fought a 4-year civil war that killed 750,000 Americans, or that the summer of 1968, 67, 69 make today's college protests look like keg parties, I think it's very important to say, yeah, you know what? Things are really hard right now, really hard. They've always been really hard. And so what can I do to take care of myself, to make the small differences where I can, and keep this all in perspective and not let the bastards get me down, frankly. Don't get notifications on your phone so that every hour you know the crazy thing that this politician you don't like said. It's not helpful. It's not useful. So there are a lot of tools that can help you at least manage the part that you can manage. And then the last thing I would say is, no, you can't solve the gridlock, but boy, it's great to go out and vote. Sure feels good to do that. Boy, it's great to join a march and make a sign if that's something you care about. Dan Harris of 10% Happier, I think he coined the phrase, action absorbs anxiety. No, I'm not going to solve climate change, but can I, actively recycle and drive an electric car and drive less? And another very long answer to a pretty straightforward question, but I think it's really important to understand we've always lived in difficult times. And frankly, we have more tools at our disposal now to do something about it than we've ever had.
And I appreciate that perspective. I always try to think about it through the lens of my parents' life experience, which was depression, followed by World War II, followed by what I think for them, moving from coal miner children to college graduates to then the 60s and raising adolescents at a time in great turmoil, and then the 70s and the oil crisis. So putting it in the context of my parents' lives, it's a pendulum. We're going to all experience those ups and downs throughout the historical landscape. And it is what we make of it. It is what we make of our place in the world.
Jackie, I was honored to give a talk to a high school graduation 2 Junes ago. And I said, I'm sure you're sitting there looking at my generation saying, thanks a lot. You've left us with a mess. And I said, yes, we have. But with all due respect, every generation leaves the next one with a mess. And I talked about my dad's side of my family, where my grandfather left college to go fight in World War I, a war that was started by his parents' generation. His oldest son, my uncle, left high school to fight in World War II, a war that was caused by his dad's generation and the remnants of World War I. My father missed World War II, went ROTC to University of Vermont, and was shipped off to Korea. And my oldest brother missed the Vietnam draft, by 3 years. And I'm talking to a bunch of high school graduates who aren't even thinking about any of that. And I said, our generation whiffed on climate change, but when I was in your seats in high school, we had acid rain in the ozone layer. Remember those? We had AIDS, we had apartheid, we had boycotting each other's Olympics. We were talking constantly about nuclear annihilation. And so, again, to that earlier point, it's always been hard. The challenges change, but they're always here. And the other thing I told that crowd, AIDS, apartheid, ozone layer, all those things have been checked off since my high school graduation, for the most part. But how? Ozone layer, we listened to the scientists, we banned fluorofluorocarbons, when I got to college, the protests were about divesting from South Africa. So that's how things improve. And if today's high school generation says, we're screwed, or college age kids I hear say, I'm not going to have kids because the world's going to end in 30 years from climate change, that's when we have a problem.
Well, Bill, you've set a high standard for the Optimism Institute, and particularly for Blue Sky Podcast. Tell us where you go from here.
Oh, well, thank you, first of all. Yeah, so it's funny whenever people refer to the Institute, the name is somewhat tongue-in-cheek because you're talking to the entire Institute. I have freelancers who help me with graphics and that sort of thing, and the editing of the podcast. It's been fun for me because as I sort of laid out the plan, it has gone the way I hope, knock on wood, where I wanted to start with a podcast, try to make it as professional and get the best guests I can get, and really try to build an audience there. Move into public speaking, which is now starting to get a lot of traction and people seem to respond to that. I love public speaking, really enjoy it. And now I'm working on a book as well. And what's been fun is I thought I knew a lot when I got into this about this subject. I was just scratching the surface. I've learned so much more about it in the time since. I've met remarkable people like you all. There is sort of this fun little community of people doing similar work, way more than people realize. I thought I was blazing some trail. And there's a lot of folks talking about similar things in a great way. In fact, I've talked to some about maybe take the Optimism Institute and start the Optimism Network and try to create a network effect that would lift all these boats. One volume might be able to do better, help people with this subject that I personally think is really important.
Well, good luck with that, and thank you for joining us today. And I think I can speak for Jackie and I that count us in on the Optimism Network. We'd be involved.
You got it.
Thank you so much, Bill.
I appreciate it. Great to be with you, and keep up the great work. Thank you.
Jackie, I'd love to say that was a very optimistic episode. I loved it. And having someone like Bill with his energy and focus and dedication to the same ideas that we envisioned when we changed our theme to optimism in action. Thanks to Bill and his vision and what he's doing with the Optimism Institute and the Blue Sky podcast.
What I loved about it, too, is it's what we hoped with Optimism in Action to actually show what he's attempting to do as well, which is that it's not a feeling that you're optimistic. It's not just sitting around and saying it's going to get better, but it's actually doing something. It's taking action. And the way that we've been able to shine a light on different people who are seeing things in the world that they want to see changed and taking action to change it, that's his definition of optimism. And I love the synergy between our two podcasts. Once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today on Sidebar. And as always, Mitch and I would love to know what's on your mind. You can reach us at SideBarMedia.org.
Sidebar would not be possible without our producer, David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on Sidebar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates Sidebar's social media marketing.
Optimism in Action is produced in collaboration with KAZU, your NPR station for the Monterey Bay area of California. You'll find this episode and archived episodes at kazu.org/sidebar.